thank you very much for coming along again this evening. This evening we're going to take a look at a new venture that's starting up around the world. It's not just here in Cambridge, but it's all over the world at this point, and it's actually quite promising. Quite promising in the sense that we're going to be able to use this as scholars and students around the world in a way that not only looks back at history, but looks forward to issues of contemporary concern throughout the continent of Africa. And in fact, well beyond. The technologies that are being developed for African scholars and for the use of African planners, African statesmen, African government officials are going to be applicable elsewhere as well. But they're being demonstrated in a very powerful way in the case of Africa. So we're going to look in particular at a thing that's been developed called the Africa Map Circle. I'm going to look at the learning and teaching from maps of Africa, ancient and modern, that will serve as a kind of new equipment, a new kind of set of tools, a new set of strategies for learning how to use maps, not only to understand the past and the ancient parts of the past, but also the modern world, and as I say, the future world as well. The reason is that geography and cartography has moved us from the oldest documents that humans have recorded in the written word. Many were maps before they in fact had languages to describe the maps. But beyond the ancient, right through the whole history of literate society, and in the digital age, into space, and the use of space-based cartography for understanding our circumstances on Earth. Many of you know my name's Tim Weiskel, and I have for years, in fact, I've been teaching on African subjects. I'm an anthropologist and historian, and I've been teaching in African studies programs and African history programs, African anthropology departments for the last 50 years. In addition to doing research in Africa itself, I came back and wrote it up in forms of theses, and you can get access to these things now online. I focused on the colonial period, but well before the period of colonial conquest, there was a long history of trade in West Africa, which I didn't learn about at the time I was doing my PhD research 50 years ago, but I've started to learn about since. In a way, it's harder to learn about it because the documents, the further you go back in history, are more and more rare to find. And those that exist are usually in rare book libraries or in special collections that are hard to get access to in some cases. And the documents themselves need to be preserved very carefully because they are fragile and can, in effect, deteriorate very quickly before your eyes. But one of the people who led the study of this pre-colonial period a long time ago, over 50 years ago, about 55 years ago now as it turns out, is a fellow named Philip Curtin, who wrote a book called The Image of Africa, which was reprinted more recently in 1973 in a 2-volume series, same title, The Image of Africa, and it was basically looking at the way in which Africa was depicted prior to the period of European colonial control and prior to the emergence of accounts in the written Western European dialects. He actually, if you look into it, was a PhD from Harvard in 1953, but he did his work not on Africa, but on Jamaica. His thesis was entitled Revolution and Decline in Jamaica, 1830 through 1865, and it examined the 19th century history and the economics of Jamaica. But in a sense, he started to look at the whole Atlantic system, and he became one of the founders of the historical perspective of looking at not just Jamaica, not just Haiti, not just Cuba, not just the United States, not just West Africa as a whole, but individual itemized places linked in a global transatlantic maritime empire system. It's one of the first to develop this kind of global perspective, looking at the transatlantic trade, and then others extended it beyond the transatlantic trade to the Pacific trade, and in effect reinserted what we should have known from the beginning, namely that the world was linked around the world. Several people have taken up the theme since, and current professor at Harvard, Hutchins Brown, has done an excellent job of looking in detail at the kinds of documents that Phil Curtin drew attention to, the early maps and the early historical accounts. And Vince Brown has gone in to look at the slave revolt prior to the period that Phil Curtin was looking at. Phil Curtin started in 1830 through 1860s, and actually 100 years before that there was a slave revolt in Jamaica, which Vincent Brown has looked at in great detail. They've made historical maps the center focus of their research, and he's done an excellent job of reconstituting the maps of the period and the importance in Jamaica of the different revolts that occurred virtually simultaneously. But if you look at these old maps of the Caribbean, you can see Jamaica is just one island among many, and the islands themselves became the focal point of interest for the European trade at the time because they're pretty extraordinary. If you look at them, any island system is ideal for colonization in the sense that you can control the colonial effort pretty quickly simply by controlling the means of transport, right? You don't have to spend a lot of effort in controlling your labor force. If you own an island, you can put them on because they can't get away. You have monopolized the means of transportation, and they, in effect, are subject to your control because you control the means of transportation. Well, this is not a secret. This is the fact of Caribbean history. In fact, it was so attractive for European colonization because there were so many islands, and each one of them could be colonized fairly quickly, and was colonized very quickly by Europeans, largely because the diseases they brought with them wiped out the indigenous population very quickly. The diseases plus the animals and the plants. The invasive species, we've now started calling these things. If you introduce pigs and goats onto an island, they can go through the vegetation pretty quickly, especially if it's planted vegetation in gardens of indigenous people. And so they were facing starvation, an attack on their food supply from the animals introduced by the Europeans, at the same time that they were under stress from in effect, the diseases that they hadn't been exposed to prior to European contact. So it's important to look at this as an Atlantic system that has a systematic collapse of a labor supply in the Caribbean and the emergence of a transportation and what became known as the triangular trade of labor from West Africa. Now this is the historical system that has been documented again and again in the maps of the time, because maritime empires need maps in order to figure out where they're going, and once they figure out where they're going, they make maps like crazy. This is why in our period the effort to recover the maps is very important as a key to understanding the history of the period. The African Historical Graphics Archives is an effort in the digital age to expand and enlarge the work already begun by Philip Curtin, Vincent Brown, and others looking at the transatlantic system. And as a result of that archive, there's been a new group that's convened called the African Map Circle, learning and teaching from maps of Africa, both ancient and modern. You'll notice this one, for example, was published at about 1490, 2 years before Columbus quote-unquote discovered America, he didn't find America because it wasn't lost. It was there, right? It seems that the Chinese may have made several ventures to the Americans before Columbus, but in any case, the cartographers in 1490 had drawn maps of the world which had details about the African continent, even before they had any details about the New World. So African map circle goes back before the Columbian Moment, as it were. The Columbian Moment starting, as it were, in 1492, when Columbus uncovers in his own mapping what the Chinese and others knew, namely that there was a whole other hemisphere to be worked upon. Now, it's in these ancient books that we start to see some of the early maps. And in fact, an important new field in African history is being launched with the close digital examination of the historical texts and their printed maps. Almost all the historical texts coming out in the 17th and 18th centuries, even some in the 16th centuries, included printed maps with them. And it was one of the skills of the Europeans to develop the printing technology capable of depicting maps in mass-produced books. You can start with travel accounts and encyclopedias like these and start to look at the Foldout Maps, which are pretty extraordinary in themselves. They have, in effect, a link, in many cases, to the maps that you can explore online. When you put the maps together and place them down on a current image of Africa, it's pretty extraordinary because they overlap one another and they, in fact, provide a pretty complete picture of the coastal regions. Maps from the early 18th century, before the United States was a country, before we declared our independence from British control. The British were controlling large portions of this part of West Africa. And these maps can be digitized and georeferenced in such a way that you can place them on top of the actual geologic spaces, and something that looks unfamiliar, like this, with a map on top of it, becomes very intelligible and examinable. This is the Gambian River in West Africa, key in the slave trade. And the maps are a key to understanding, in effect, the archaeology of the area. Because these maps, made in this particular case, 1727, represents to some extent what was going on in that area. Now, the maps of the offshore islands are even more interesting in a way because you can get out to those islands that still exist. These islands you can look up. These islands aren't going anywhere. In general, the coast is very comparable to what it was back in the era of the slave trade. Some differences. And in fact, going forward, there are going to be a lot of differences because the slave trade drew a lot of people to the coast and to these offshore islands like Goree, engaged in the slave trade. But sea level is rising. And it's largely from this fact that we need now to use maps to think about a very different kind of interaction in Africa between people, maps, and their environment. If you fold out some of these maps and look at them in detail, you can consider some detailed history as well. Look at one of these, for example, that was of the Gold Coast, or in this French map, what they call the Côte d'Or de Guinée. And you can blow it up and see Royaume de Dankara and Pays d'Adom, Pays d'Akani. These are different names in French of these different ethnic groups to the interior. And you can keep blowing it up and in fact see in great detail things like coastal ports. This one of Dick's Cove is indicated on the French map as having a Fort Anglais, an English fort. And in fact, they show you a diagram of what it looks like. I shouldn't say a diagram, it's kind of a portrait. It's not so much a diagram. There are diagrams of the floor plans, as well as indications of the plantings outside these fortresses. The floor plans are the kind of diagrams that give you an indication of how much was available space for slaves, how much was available for food, how much was available for munitions, and they're published in the same books. This one of Dix Cove is published along with those maps. And sure enough, the castle still exists today. Now, however, you can get access to it from space and Google Earth. You've all got free access to Google Earth at this point, and you can call it up in a way that enables you to look around. You can either look as a straight above view and see that same fort and its floor plan as it exists now, or you can do a 3D view and in effect circle the fort as if you were in a helicopter. This is all done by the magic of Google Maps and the United States Navy. The United States Navy and NASA are the ones that take the satellite photos that make this possible. But you now have access to them through Google Earth. So this is the kind of revolutionizing technology that's making the use of maps very instructive and incredibly informative in the modern age. If we go back into a 2D view, you can even zoom in or zoom out at greater scale and see what else is going on in the region. This is extraordinarily helpful for students of African history and the like. In fact, you can even use Google Earth as a way to get inside those castles where photographs have been taken and people have left their own footsteps, in a sense. You can click on the arrows in the photographs and walk around the outside of what is, in effect, the inside of a slave castle. Now this is extraordinary new technology which makes it possible to have scholars from all over the world reflect on the history of the Atlantic slave trade, the architecture of the Atlantic slave trade, the labor force needed to build these castles even before the ships left from the coast of Africa to take the slaves to the New World. All of this is technology now available, as they say, and you can in effect walk around the inside of some of these castles, see how they looked from the land, see how they were put together, and in fact examine the architecture and see which of the architects were building similar castles on the other side of the Atlantic. The Jamaican Connection, for example. Intricate architecture. This is not lean-tos or mud huts. This is extraordinary work over an extended period of time. These are medieval castles constructed in West Africa with armaments that are really quite revealing, including the royal stamp of King George. Rex George. And King George was the one that we were trying to declare independence from in 1776 in the United States, but he had his cannons aimed out at the sea at others from the European traditions who were going to challenge his dominance on this part of the slave coast. Well, there are other castles, not just Dix Cove. There are, in fact, 30 to 40 castles that were set up in this region along the coast of Africa. Enormous structures requiring lots and lots of labor to have constructed them before any slaves got on the ships to come to the New World. Cape Coast Castle is another famous one. And in the Gambia, you can start looking at the whole region from the Senegambia area to reveals some of the forts on the island of Goree and what they look like, in effect, from Google Earth now. You can, in a sense, parachute in on these as well as the ones in Ghana and take a look more closely. In this case, if you zoom in closely enough, you can ask Google Earth for Street View. And with the Street View, you can start to, in effect, parachute into the insides of this fort and take a look at what it was like at the time, what its rooms have been made into since, and, in effect, start to discover different and new dimensions of the slave trade. All of this is possible through this kind of study, the digitization of the maps, both old and new, that make now mapping the slave trade quite possible. Beyond the slave trade, there's enormous gain to be had as well for all students and scholars of Africa, both in the United States, in Europe, and, of course, most importantly, in Africa itself. A lot of these documents weren't available to African scholars prior to digitization, but now they are available. The technologies, techniques, and software that's being developed in the process of creating a virtual map archive, the African Historical Graphics Archives that I mentioned earlier, is now extensible in virtually all directions for future university faculty and graduate research. The digital humanities offer a wide range of new possibilities for scholarships. Maps and images can now be shared around the world for scholarly collaboration on new platforms for coordinated research on a vast range of topics. Much is not known about those maps, and in fact it won't be known until African scholars can identify for us what the place names mean. The floor plans of the various forts are available, and of course when you move the virtual libraries into the colonial period itself, there's enormous amounts of historical postcard and photographic material. You can analyze those very closely and see, in fact, down to the eyeball level, what kinds of attitudes are being reflected throughout these colonial photographs. We could decolonize history, in a sense, by looking at the important materials from a new lens. Maps might just be the beginning of the new themes in African and transatlantic studies. Stay tuned, because analyzing colonial photographs might be even more important. Elsewhere, this has started to happen. Here in the Americas, there is now an early Caribbean digital archive that preserves many of the documents from that early trade and early working conditions in plantations on the Caribbean islands. But the Africa Map Circle is a new venue that you should join. It's a virtual community, and it's learning and teaching from maps of Africa, both ancient and modern. You can scan the QR code and ask yourself and ask your friends, how can it help you learn more and teach about Africa? There's going to be a forthcoming lecture in the African Studies meetings coming up in a couple of weeks here in Boston. But questions like this are going to be addressed in the future. The European Enlightenment and the Dark Continent. Maps, scenes, views, and the imaging of Africa through the lens of the coastal trade. If you spent all your time in the coast and didn't get to the interior, what kind of image would you have prior to, in effect, the 20th century? The European Enlightenment and the Dark Continent, another great subject that's being looked into in terms of the map, scenes, and views, and the imaging of Africa in the era of the slave trade. This is pretty extraordinary. Just when the European Enlightenment was taking off, it was based, in many cases, on the wealth that was generated from the slave trade, as was much of its art. And it's for this reason, there's a good reason to start imagining all over again the image of Africa. French were, in fact, very famous at one point because of a scholar who noted that there's a difference between reality and the image of reality. As he said, "Ceci n'est pas une pipe." This is not a pipe. Well, it's also true that "Ceci n'est pas l'Afrique." That is to say, this is not Africa, this is an image of Africa. So we need to revisit the imaging of the Dark Continent that Phil Curtin started 55 years ago. Furthermore, we can take it into outer space. From ancient maps to outer space, we can look from Google Earth, from interplanetary space, at what Africa looks like. So this is what the African Map Circle is opening up as a possibility. It was, in effect, organized as a project of the African Historical Graphics Archive in order to expand human understanding in the digital age. If human civilization is going to survive, we must learn about all peoples at this point, all peoples around the world, about their history and their interaction for hundreds of years.